Thank you very much for joining us this afternoon in Japan and this morning in Israel. I am Satoshi Ikeuchi, a professor of religion and global security at the Research Center for Advanced Science and Technology, RCAST, of the University of Tokyo, and the founding chair of the ROLES, RCAST Open Laboratory for Emergence Strategies, and the moderator of this webinar. This webinar is the opening event of the Israel Month at UTokyo Komaba Research Campus, which runs from February 17 to March 16. The year 2022 marks the 70th anniversary of the establishment of diplomatic relations between Israel and Japan. We are very pleased to host this Israel Month event, which will feature a series of webinars on the latest trends and developments in Israel and their impact on Japan-Israel relations. I would like to take this opportunity to thank our wonderful speakers from Israel and Japan, and the Embassy of Israel in Japan for its tremendous support. Israel Month is organized by ROLES of the University of Tokyo and supported by the Embassy of Israel in Japan. First, a short announcement. Simultaneous English-Japanese interpretation is available at this Zoom webinar. Clicking the interpretation button on the toolbar at the bottom of the Zoom webinar window allows you to select the language you want to hear. 今日は翻訳がついておりますので、日本語をご希望の方、画面の、おそらく下の方にあると思うんですが、言語を変えるボタンを、ちょっと使ってみてください。はい。Before we begin our webinar today, we have an opening remark by Mr. Gilad Cohen, Israeli ambassador to Japan. Ambassador Cohen, we welcome your opening remarks.
Thank you very much. Thank you for having me. Konnichiwa. Yoroshiku onegaishimasu. I'm very glad and happy to open the month, Israeli month, together with the University of Tokyo, and would like to thank the university for the cooperation. I know on the other side there are a lot of people from Israel looking at it, and I just want to say hello to everybody, to my dear friend Professor Nissim Otmazgin and others. I understand that there is a lot of 10 webinars about Israel, about the region, about Japan, technology, geopolitics, history, religion, and also Israeli-Japan relations, where people from the academy from Israel and Japan will talk together. This is very, very important for me, and I think for the relations. You know, we are going to have in a week or two from now joint committee on science, for example, and we are going to talk about joint projects, joint researches that we want to launch together with the support of the Israeli and Japanese government. This is very important. This bond is very, very important because I think that we can contribute to each other in every aspect, not only in economy, but also in research and academy and science and medicine and education. Everything, the sky's the limit. I think the range of topics that are going to be discussed during this lovely month is also a representation and showing and a reflection of the good relations we have now between Israel and Japan. I think that we are, I know, as you said, rightly, we are celebrating 70 years anniversary of the relations. And during the last years, there was a great progress in the relations. I can tell you that when I came here, I heard from each and every person that I met, from the government, from the private sector, from the academy, from culture, from music, from everybody, that this is that we are just, this year is going to be the big start, the big jump, not started 70 years ago, but a giant leap forward for the relations between Israel and Japan. I think that the atmosphere is there. I think the political will is there, both in Jerusalem and here in Tokyo. And I think that we can see a lot of progress. You can see it in the economic relations. Just 2 weeks ago, there was a report published by Hertz Harel investment company in Israel to show that only in 2021, the level of investments of Japan and Israel increased from $1 billion in 2020 to $3 billion. It's almost numbers. I met just this week, I met former Prime Minister Abe. He told me when I came to Israel in 2015, numbers of Japanese companies in Israel were 20 to 30. Today, we have almost 100 Japanese companies which work in Israel and have these innovation centers and R&D centers, which is, again, a reflection. Israel wants to come because a lot of resources and money is pouring in Israel because of cyber, because of high tech, because of technology and startups. So now the economy is very strong. Just yet today, it was published that the rate of the Israeli progress in the economy is 8.1%. You know, so it's thing that we can complement each other. We can work together, and we can do a lot of things. I see a lot of eagerness in the private sector and the public sector here in Japan to work with Israel. And I know that Israel want to work with Japan. I just received a phone call from one of the assistants of one of the ministers in Israel who would like very much to come to Japan. And I know that there are 36 ministers in Israel. I believe that every one of them would like to come and visit here. And I believe that Japanese ministers would like to come and visit Israel. We have some good news that I hear today from here in Japan, that maybe, I know the Prime Minister Kishida is going to conduct a press conference soon. Maybe there will be easing up of restrictions of entering into Japan. And more important even, that for Japanese citizens who are vaccinated 3 times to go abroad and come back. The problem is that you cannot go abroad because you have to come into quarantine you had to come to quarantine of 2 weeks or a week. So now it will be reduced, I hope to 0, and the restrictions are going to be lifted, I hope soon, and then it will enable the good tourism, commerce, investments, and so on, and also, of course, visits. I think this is a new era of the relations. I think the direct lines that I hope that we can establish, El Al will establish this September between Japan and Israel would be very good to relations. Direct line is an instrument, a tool that is very, very important, and I hope that we can realize it. Of course, it will depend in the COVID-19 restrictions and situation. We've signed the Abraham Accords more than a year ago. I think the cooperation between Israel, the Gulf states, and Japan can be tremendous. We just had 2 weeks ago a trilateral innovation session and seminar between Israel, Japan, and the Emirates. More than 500 people attended from 3 sides. And there's a lot. I've just met this morning a member of parliament. They want a rice from Chiba is going to have cultural stamp and be exported from Japan to Dubai and will be spread. Anyway, this is the cooperation I'm talking about. And I think that Japan has a lot of interest in stability in the Middle East. I think this new era, historic peace agreements between Israel and the Gulf states would be beneficial for Japan. And I hope that Japan will contribute also to it and will benefit from what's happening, the stability now in the Middle East and the peace between Israel and its Arab neighbors. I do hope that we are going to, this year, sign agreements, bilateral agreements. We are working on it between Japan and Israel. We'll have events here in Japan and in Israel. I hope that we are going to have a first ever presidential bilateral visit from Israel to come to Tokyo. The father of President Herzog was here, but for the funeral of Emperor Hirohito and the coronation of his son, but not in a bilateral visit. I think this is the time now to come as the president, number one citizen of Israel, to come and pay respect to His Majesty the Emperor and to Japan, and also build on the relations. So there are many things that we are working on now. I hope that we are now in the final stage of going out of this corona, and then we can start taking off in the relations, because it's really difficult for us to work here. And I know that for Japanese diplomats in Israel, it's also not easy. I do hope that we are going to enjoy, and to the audience and to everybody who's participating this month, Israel month. I can tell you that the potential is huge. Don't tell anybody in Israel, but I'm enjoying every minute of my stay here. It's the time of my life. It's really Japan. I'm just fascinated and very happy to be here. The Israeli guys, please don't be envy. I hope that the sky is going to be open, so you will come again. You will come also and enjoy this beautiful place and beautiful people and excellent food and everything that we can learn from our friends in Japan. And I think that we can also learn and listen and also share with our experience in all fields. There are also fields of security and cyber and other things, but we are not going to touch all of them. I just want to conclude, because I've been given 5 minutes. I don't want to be out of it. In Japan, this is one thing that I learned in Japan: you start on time and you finish on time. So I don't want to exceed more. I do want to really thank Professor Ikeuchi for really organizing it, for your activity in organizing this event. I do want to thank Dr. Sujita, and to both of you. I do want to acknowledge and thank our friends and academicians in Israel. I do hope that the sky will be open both sides, and then you can exchange without me. When academy is working without the government, it's the best thing that can happen. When researchers and scientists are working together without us, the government, we can support. It's the best thing. It's like commerce. It's like investment. We are the government. Sometimes we just disturb. But I'm here in order to really be some kind of catalyst or an engine to the relations. I'll do my best to work for the interests of Israel here in Japan and to present the interests of Japan in Israel. So, domo arigatou gozaimashita. Thank you very much and good luck.
どうもありがとうございます。Thank you very much, Ambassador Cohen, for your very warm and informative remarks. And really, it really matters for us, for all of us. Thank you very much. And as Ambassador Cohen emphasized, Japan-Israeli relations have been never abated its pace of growth even under the COVID-19. So investments from Japan to Israel is still continues to be skyrocketing, and many companies are set up here over there in Israel, and actually even under the COVID-19 restrictions, young businessmen from Japan is visiting Israel, and so we are waiting for any government restrictions on our side lifted. It's on Israeli side, actually it was almost lifted, almost everything. So we are ready to resume our relationship. So thank you very much for your kind support for our entire program. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
So let's begin our webinar. At this opening and keynote webinar, Israel and Japan in the New World Order, Professor Nissim Otmazgin, the Dean of the Faculty of Humanities at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, will provide a unique insight into the evolving relationship between Israel and Japan. Professor Otmazgin is a renowned expert on Japanese studies. He is the author, editor of at least 8 books on contemporary culture and politics in Asia, particularly Japan and its relationship with East and Southeast Asian countries. He holds a doctorate from Kyoto University on the export of Japan's popular culture to Asia, and his dissertation won the UA Asia Pacific Research Prize in October 2007 for the outstanding dissertation on society and culture in Asia. His expertise is wide and comprehensive, including Japanese popular culture in Asia, popular culture and regionalization in East and Southeast Asia, Japan-Southeast Asian relations, and the cultural industry and the cultural policy in Japan and South Korea. Today, he will give us a comprehensive picture of Japan-Israeli relations from its inception in history to the recent and present expansion of economic and cultural exchanges. If you have any questions or comments to our speaker beforehand, during the speech, please click the Q&A button on the toolbar at the bottom of the Zoom webinar window. So thank you for waiting. Professor Otmazgin, it's your turn.
Thank you so much. I would like to thank the organizers of this Israel Month at the University of Tokyo, Professor Ikeuchi Satoshi and Dr. Tsujita Toshiya, for initiating this wonderful event, and for Professor Ikeda Akifumi for serving as the commentator for my talk. I would also like to thank Ambassador Gilad Cohen for his very kind introduction. As a scholar of Japan and as an Israeli, this makes me especially happy, and I'm glad to contribute my part for this occasion. Please allow me to add my presentation. Okay, can you see my presentation? Just to make sure.
Yes.
Okay, wonderful, thank you. Indeed, the 70th anniversary of Israel-Japan relations is a remarkable event which both countries should be proud of. Located on the most extreme sides of the Asian continent, the state of Israel and the state of Japan are considered success stories. They have both emerged within remarkable histories, and for the past 7 decades, both are successfully maintaining a stable democracy. In the Economist World Democracy Index, Japan ranks 17, while Israel is ranked 23, very close to each other. For me, as an Israeli who studied and lived in Japan for almost 10 years, whose older daughter was born in Japan and teaches about Japanese history and politics and culture at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, this is a special celebration. In this talk, I was asked to shortly summarize Israel-Japan relationships and rethink the prospects of these relationships in the 21st century. This is, of course, a too big project for a 30-minute talk, and naturally I cannot discuss all details. Instead, I would like to suggest that the Israeli-Japanese relations should be viewed within 3 layers or 3 dimensions, which together provide for stable and long-lasting relationships. One is historical, the other is diplomatic, and the third is based on people-to-people relationships. More specifically, I would like to suggest a multi-layered approach for understanding Japanese-Israeli relations. In the context of Japan's relations with the wider Jewish world, in the context of diplomatic and economic relationship between the 2 states, Japan and Israel, and in the context of cultural interaction between Japanese and Israeli culture and Japanese and Israeli people. First, contemporary Israel-Japan relationships should be viewed in as an historical continuation of Japanese-Jewish relationships. These relations, as far as we know, are extended to the arrival of Jews to Japan in the second half of the 19th century. There were probably earlier contacts between Jews and Japanese, but for the purpose of this talk, I think that the second half of the 19th century is a good period to start. In modern times, Jews started arriving in Japan during the Bakumatsu period after 1853, when Commodore Perry of the United States Navy arrived in Japan and forced it to open its gate to outsiders. Jews came from America, Russia, and Poland, but there were also a few that did the journey from India, Baghdad, and neighboring China, Hong Kong, and Singapore. They came to Japan to seek for business opportunities in the growing trade in the Far East, or during World War II as refugees fleeing from the Holocaust in Europe. Many of them made Japan their home. Eventually, Jewish communities were established in Tokyo and in the port cities of Kobe and Nagasaki. The first non-Jews to arrive to Yokohama in the early modern periods were the Marx brothers, who came from Britain in 1861. They settled in Yokohama, which back then was a small fishing village designated by the Tokugawa shogunate as a place where foreigners can settle. The Marx brothers were involved in the trading business, especially importing goods from Australia. One of the brothers, Alexander Marx, also wrote articles about Japan and its culture for the London-based newspaper Jewish Chronicle. He eventually settled in Australia, where he was appointed as the first consul general in Australia for Japan, a position he held for 15 years. Raphael Scheuer, a Baltimore-born Jewish-American merchant, was also one of the first Jewish pioneers to arrive to Japan. He settled in Yokohama in 1861, where he was not only involved in the trading business, but was also the publisher of the Japan Express, one of the first foreign language newspapers to appear in Japan. You can see in the picture, the Japan Express. For a few years, he also served as the president of the Foreigners Municipal Council. Raphael Scheuer is buried at the Jewish section of the Yokohama Cemetery, back to back with the grave of another interesting figure of the time, Charles Richardson. Richardson is known for the famous Namamugi incident, Namamugi Jiken, of September 1862, where he found his death. The Jewish community in Nagasaki was established in the 1880s, and at its peak in the turn of the 19th century was the biggest Jewish community in Japan, home for about 100 families, mostly from Russia. Nagasaki of these days was an important trading center and part of a network of trading ports stretching from Russia and China and until Southeast Asia. In 1894, the Bet Israel, the House of Israel synagogue, was established, the first synagogue in modern Japan. One of the families which were active commercially in Nagasaki were the Sassoon family. The Sassoon family, sometimes called the Rothschild of the East, due to the immense wealth they accumulated in finance and trade, was originally from Baghdad, later moved to Bombay, and then spread to China, Southeast Asia, and England. They also held trading branches in Yokohama and Kobe, which were connected to their global network of businesses with headquarters in Bombay and Shanghai. The Nagasaki Jewish community was officially closed in the early 1920s, following the decline of Nagasaki as a major trading center. Another early Jewish settlement was established in Kobe, which, like Yokohama and Nagasaki, was open to foreign trade in the second half of the 19th century. Jewish traders started settling in the city, and its first synagogue was erected in 1912. The city's Jewish community increased following the Kanto earthquake of 1923 that destroyed much of Tokyo. In the early stages of World War II, Kobe unexpectedly started to receive thousands of Jewish refugees fleeing from the Holocaust in Europe. Thanks to the passes visa issued by the Japanese diplomat in Lithuania, Sugihara Chiune, about 4,600 Jewish refugees reached Japan through the ports of Tsuruga and received shelter in Kobe. About 1,000 of them were able to secure transit to other parts of the world. Nowadays, the name Sugihara Chiune is probably known to every Israeli. Here are cemeteries, Jewish cemeteries, which are located in 3 different parts of Japan, one in Nagasaki, in Kobe, and in Yokohama. And this is the picture of the synagogue in Kobe, which is still active. I was there a few years ago. The presence of Jews in Japan produced a few incredible stories. Allow me to give only 3 interesting examples for such stories. One interesting story is of Bernard Bethlehem, who arrived to Naha on board a British ship together with his wife and 2 kids in 1846, years before the formal opening of Japan. Bethlehem was born as an Hungarian Jew and at his youth studied to become a rabbi. Upon traveling to Italy and England, however, he converted into Christianity, earned a degree in medicine, and mastered a few languages, including French, German, Hebrew, English, Hungarian, Italian, and eventually some Japanese. Against the wish of the authorities in Naha, he managed to embark the ship and stayed in the island for 7 long years, taking residence in the Gokokuji temple. In Naha, his second daughter was born in 1848, probably the first European to be born in Okinawa. Bethlehem's purpose was to spread Christianity, but in spite of his insistence, his mission was a failure due to the lack of cooperation from the authorities and the people of the Ryukyus. In 1854, he finally left Naha, not before going to meet Commodore Perry on the ship and offering his help. According to Dr. Doron Cohen, an Israeli professor teaching at Doshisha University, who wrote a book on the Japanese translations of the Bible, Bethlehem is also responsible for the first attempt to translate the Old Testament into Japanese. With the help of local Okinawans, whose knowledge of Japanese was limited, he translated part of the Bible stories. The second story is of Mr. Felix Tikotin, which you can see here in the picture, a German-born Jew and a Holocaust survivor. Mr. Tikotin was born in 1893 in a small city in Germany and spent most of his younger years in Dresden, where he studied architecture. After drafted to the German army and serving as an officer in World War I, he traveled to Japan on the Trans-Siberian train and immediately fell in love with the Japanese culture. Mr. Tikotin passionately started collecting Japanese art, and in 1927, he's opened his first gallery in Berlin. For more than 10 years, he continued to organize Japanese art exhibitions in museums across Europe. During World War II, Mr. Tikotin and his family had to escape Nazi persecution into neighboring Holland and went in hiding. Luckily, he and his family survived the Holocaust, but much of his Japanese art collection was lost. Surviving the war, Mr. Tikotin decided to go back to his old love and traveled to Japan frequently, using old connections to build his art collection again. His collection soon became one of the most outstanding private collections in Europe. In 1956, he decided to immigrate to Israel with his entire collection and donated it to the city of Haifa. Today, under the skillful hands of Dr. Eti Gissis, an Israeli art historian who studied in Japan, the Tikotin Museum has an impressive collection of 9,000 items of arts and crafts, mainly from the 17th to the 19th centuries, including paintings, prints, ukiyo-e, painted screens, ceramics, netsuke, lacquer and metalwork, and so on. This is some pictures of Haifa's Tikotin Museum, which is probably the only museum outside of Japan dedicated only for Japanese art and not part of a wider Asian collection. A last incredible story is of Shaul Eisenberg, which you can see here at the picture. Eisenberg was a Jewish refugee who arrived to Japan in 1940 at the age of 19. Surviving the war, living in Tokyo, he made Japan his home. He eventually married a Japanese wife, excelled in business, and by the 1960s became one of the world's richest people. Eisenberg and his wife lived in Tokyo, but they had to flee to the countryside during the World War II to hide from the American airplane bombing. They lived in a small house in Miyota village close to Karuizawa, and Eisenberg was sometimes recruited to forced labor for the military together with other village people. During the war, food was scarce, and Eisenberg went from time to time to search for food. When the war ended, Eisenberg and Leah, his wife, returned to Tokyo and discovered that everything was burned during the war. The Eisenberg couple rented a small house in Okachimachi district in Tokyo, and like many other Japanese at the time, started to rebuild their lives. Eisenberg, who had no formal education, has proved himself as a successful businessman. He made connections with officers from the American occupation forces and started to mediate between American and Japanese companies. In the 50s, he expanded his business to Korea, where he invested in factories and other businesses. Eisenberg gradually expanded his business outside of and across East Asia. His investments include trade, industry, real estate, telecommunication, energy, banking, and shipping. In Korea, he even lent money to Samsung before it became so successful. Eisenberg was one of the first foreigners to enter the Chinese market in the 1970s, already owned a few factories in the country. He later expanded his investment to Europe, South America, Africa, and the Middle East. For many years, he was the main sponsor of the Jewish community in Tokyo. He donated money to build the Jewish community building, which is these days located in Hiro in Tokyo, and purchased the Jewish section at the Yokohama Foreign Graveyard, Gaikoku Jinbochi. I tried to give some testimonies to early encounters between Jews and Japanese in the modern period. These encounters were made possible by the efforts of ambitious individuals who came to Japan, adjusted to a new culture, and settled in different parts of the country. Nowadays, two Jewish communities still exist in Japan. One is in Tokyo and the other one in Kobe, and a smaller one is now in the making in Kyoto. The image and attitude toward the state of Israel was no doubt shaped by historical encounters and images of Jews in Japan. Let me give one example from an unexpected medium, from manga. Tezuka Osamu, the god of manga as he is called in Japan, wrote a famous manga series called Adolf Nitsugu, Reconstructing Adolf. It is a daring blend of fact and fiction situated in the early 20th century in the then cosmopolitan city of Kobe, telling the story of two children named Adolf. One is a Jew whose father was has a bakery, and the second one is the son of a Japanese wife and a father who was a Nazi diplomat. The two children are good friends and they play together. They love each other. This is until the German Adolf is called to Germany. The depiction in this manga is of a half-imaginative Jewish life in Japan, Europe, and then in Israel, Palestine. In spite of the drama and the atrocities in this manga, Adolf Nitsugu is basically a very humanistic story, which tells the story of two children whose life are shaken by the turbulences of war. In other words, this manga portrays images of Jewishness and of history in a semi-fictional past. I was very surprised when I came to Japan to see this manga, and I got to like it very much because it tells some of the images and sometimes stereotypes of historical events. The second dimension in Israel-Japan relations is the official diplomatic relations formed between the two countries in 1952. Israel was one of the first Asian countries Japan has signed official diplomatic relations with since gaining independence from the American occupation. Forming diplomatic relations was not so easy at the beginning, since both countries were far from each other and the foreign ministries of both were just starting to expand their interest globally. I looked at some of the documents, some of the early documents at the Israeli Foreign Ministry's archive, talking about the beginning of relations between Israel and Japan. Going through these documents, they show that there was much interest in Japanese politics and a constant demand of Israeli Foreign Ministry to establish a stable representative in Tokyo. In a document from December 1954, for example, Joseph Linton, the Israeli representative to Japan, reports to the Foreign Minister Moshe Sharet about Japanese politics with the hope that regular Japanese mission will be open in Israel. The importance of establishing a Japanese legation to Israel is of high priority. Finally, the new Japanese Foreign Minister made up to the promise of the previous administration to appoint a minister by the end of the year. The Foreign Ministry announced the appointment of Shinichi Kamimura as the minister to Israel, and the news was reported at the Nippon Times in December 26. The diplomatic relations continued, of course, to these days, with senior Israeli and Japanese diplomats stationed as ambassadors and with active embassies in Tokyo and in Tel Aviv. But there were also moments of tensions between the two relations in the two countries. One major tension was following the first oil shock, when Japan issued a strong diplomatic statement implying it might consider its relationship with Israel. According to the statement released in November 22, 1973, by the Chief Cabinet Secretary then, Susumu Nikaido, the government of Japan will continue to observe the situation in the Middle East with grave concern, and depending on future developments, may have to reconsider its policy towards Israel. The government of Japan, deploring Israel's continued occupation of Arab territories, urges Israel to comply with these principles. The diplomatic relationship survived this crisis and continued, but remained on a low level until becoming warmer and much closer following the 2002 Oslo Peace Accord between Israel and the Palestinians. The Japanese government in the 2000s was willing to take an active role in the then Israeli-Palestinian peace process, and to this day provides ODA and assist the Palestinians in different projects to empower local industry and human development. On the economic front, the commercial relations between the two countries has increased, moving from simple trade to a much more diverse form of economic relations, including investment and technological transfer. Over the past 3 decades, trade between the two countries is booming. The majority of electronic devices and equipment in Israel is Japanese, and Japanese automobiles is highly popular in Israel. In exchange, Israel used to sell Japan diamonds, agricultural equipments, and more recently, technology. Here are some names of Japanese companies very recently becoming active in the Israeli market through trade and services. Sumitomo, Mitsubishi, SoftBank, Takeda Pharma, Yokohama Tires, Mitsubishi Tanabe, Mitsubishi Sumitomo Insurance, Sompo, and so on, and NTT, and so on and so forth. And as Ambassador Cohen quoted the Harel Hertz report, in 2021, a $3 billion investment, Japanese investment came to Israel. No doubt, in Israel, Japan has built a reputation as an economic success story and a stable ally. Former Prime Minister Abe Shinzo visited Israel twice, in 2015 and 2008 again, marking the consolidation of bilateral relationship and the extension of cooperation on issues related to economy, cyber, health, and academia. The third context, which is relatively overlooked, is the people-to-people relationships. In addition to the historical and political aspect, over the years, Israeli and Japanese individuals started to meet each other in big numbers through tourism and through cultural and educational activities. Many middle-class Israelis are interested in Japanese culture and tradition. Until the corona outbreak, Japan was a favorite destination for Israeli tourists, and direct flights between Tel Aviv and Tokyo were about to start. Let me provide only a few examples for this people-to-people relationships, as I call it. I will start with architecture. Any visitor walking these days in the streets of central Jerusalem, near the famous Russian Orthodox Church, can easily notice the huge construction of a new compound of buildings. The new compound, to be completed by the end of 2022, will be the new campus of Bezalel School of Arts and Design, Israel's leading art and design academy, something maybe equivalent to Tokyo Gaidai. The architecture of the campus is designed by the Tokyo-based architecture firm Sanai, which you can see here in the picture. Sanai designed a new campus that attempts to both adjust itself to Jerusalem architecture history, but also introduce something new. For this purpose, the Sanai team held an intensive dialogue with relevant shareholders, the Mayor of Jerusalem, the Bezalel Academy, the Jerusalem Planning Committee, and the owners of other buildings in the area. They also had to learn about the history of Jerusalem, the people who live in the city, and the relevant construction legislation. Their partners to this dialogue was an Israeli architect, Aryeh Kutz, the owner of Tel Aviv-based architecture firm Nir Kutz Architects, who studied in Japan and speaks Japanese. He accompanied the Sinai team from its early planning stages to the securing permission from the authorities. So this is one example from architecture, how a kind of cultural and people-to-people dialogue is being initiated on a grassroots level. The final building, by the way, will look very Japanese or modern Japanese architecture with big glasses all over and with a very simple lines, which Japanese architectures are famous for. Many young Israelis like Japanese anime and manga. Twice a year, Israeli fans of anime and manga organize nationwide cosplay events. The one in March, called HavaCon, draws thousands of cosplayers in the Middle East's biggest gathering of its kind. In these events, Israeli cosplayers display their costume, meet with friends, and exchange news about Japanese contemporary culture. Catching the eye of the Japanese embassy to Israel, in previous years, Japanese ambassadors appeared in the HavaCon dressed as one piece and offered the words of greetings. This is Ambassador Tomita, who is currently the Japanese ambassador to the United States. The impact of Japanese and manga is most strongly felt in the university. As a professor for Japanese studies, as professors of Japanese studies anywhere in the world can testify, these days, manga and anime is what brings students into class and not the Japanese economy or the Japanese managerial system as it used to be back in the 80s. Students across the world choose to dedicate years of their lives and travel to Japan after watching anime on TV or online, or after knowing about its vibrant street culture. And Israel is no different for that. At the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, courses on Japan started as far back as 1958, the first in the Middle East, with a few dedicated students. Professor Meron Menzini was the first Israeli to teach Japanese history at the university. Later on, Professor Ehud Harari and Professor Ben Ami Shiloni have built the field of Japanese studies for Japanese students and instructed thousands of students, including myself. These days at Hebrew University, Tel Aviv University, Haifa University, and some other places, hundreds of young Israelis decided to dedicate years of their lives majoring in Japanese studies, including about history, culture, society, politics, and of course, language, with the hope of continuing the studies in Japan or for Japan-related job. A few hundreds more students take selective courses on Japan. At the Hebrew University where I teach, we even have a Japanese art collection with wood prints, ukiyo-e, dated from the 17th to the 20th century, and the Japanese academic book collection. Responding to the growing demands of the students, a few years ago, inside the university, we established our own manga library, located in a special room in the library. It has almost 10,000 books, manga books in Japanese, and this is a picture taken just last month, where I showed this the manga book exhibition to a guest from Japan. A recent evidence to the huge interest in Japan and its phenomenal success is the Yayoi Kusama's art exhibition at the Tel Aviv Museum, which started in 2021 and is about to finish these days. All the tickets for the exhibition were already sold out months in advance. You cannot get the ticket to get in. I can't remember when was the last time that such a rush of people for the museum in Israel happened. To summarize my talk, I think it is important to view relationships between countries via different layers and not only focus on one aspect. In the case of Israel and Japan, as I tried to show, there are extended historical, diplomatic, and cultural relations. It is no surprise then that Japan is ranked high among Israelis and, at least until the outbreak of Corona, the image of Japan remained highly positive among the Israeli public. I think that the next step is moving from diplomacy and economy to people relationships. We should know each other more. We should meet much more. We should learn from each other. I hope that the borders will open soon and tourists and students can fly in between the two countries. I wish to thank again the organizers for this wonderful event, as well as to all the individuals and organizations that consolidate and expand the relationship between Israel and Japan. I wish both countries an even brighter future. Thank you very much for listening and have a successful 1 month Israel-Japan relations. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Otmazgin. Thank you for your clear-cut, three-dimensional analysis of the Japan-Israeli relationship. And three-dimension means political, diplomatic, and economic investment, and human to human, people to people, grassroots relationship. You emphasized on the third one. Of course, that's important and will. But at the same time, I still want to ask about the first one, political diplomatic. How do you, what kind of opinion do you have in the present situation right after COVID-19, right after Abraham Accord? But before that, I ask Professor Ikeda for his comment and a question. Professor Ikeda is the president of the東洋英和University. Professor Ikeda has published numerous papers on Israeli politics, and particularly civil-military relations of Israel and the wider Middle East. He has been almost away from his 8 years job as the president of a university. So welcome back to academia. So Professor Ikeda, please.
はい、ありがとうございます。私はちょっと日本語でやらせていただきますが、ちょっとびっくりしてるんですね、今。オトマズギン先生のプレゼンテーションが、30分かそこらのプレゼンテーションで、これだけその情報量の多いですね、ものを非常に簡潔に分かりやすくまとめられて、我々に提示されたというので、ちょっと何と言っていいのかよくわからないくらいの感銘を受けてるわけです。で、私のコメントはですね、ちょっと中によく知ってる名前が出てきましたから、その人たちとの関わりのアネクドートからお話ししたいと思います。それはメロン・メズィーニさんとかエフダ・ハラリ先生、ベン・アミ・シュロニー先生、私が一番最初にイスラエルの研究を始めた時に非常によくしてくれた先生方で、もう40年以上前にこういう先生方と知り合って、その時はほとんど日本ではイスラエル研究っていうのは特に社会科学政治学研究というのは手つかずの状況だったと思います。ですがそこで手取り足取り指導していただいたという記憶がございます。ただ面白いのはですね、その先生方がみんな共通してあるジョークを私にですね、披露してくれたわけです。でそのジョークって何かっていうとですね、日本とイスラエルっていうのは、ユーラシアの西の端と東の端にあって、でものすごくその双方の距離も遠くて、非常にたくさんのものが違っていると。しかしながらたった一つのことは共通であるというような話だったんですね。でその一つのことって何ですかって聞くと、みんな揃いも揃ってですね、両方とも魚に囲まれてるんだというわけです。 で、どういうことですかと聞き返すと、日本は当然ながら島国でありますから、周りは全部海で、魚に囲まれてるっていうのは分かるわけですが、しかしながらイスラエルはどういうことですかっていうと、ヘブライ語で魚っていうのはデンジャーという意味なんだと。要するにイスラエルは危険に囲まれてるんで、その意味で日本もイスラエルも同じく魚に囲まれてるというのが、落とし話だったわけですね。で、私はその時はその非常にウィットに富んだ面白いジョークだとは思ったんですが、ただしその当時のもう今から40年以上前の冷戦の最中ではあったわけですけども、日本人としては必ずしもピンとは来なかった。その当時言われていたのはいわゆる平和ボケという言葉でありまして、その日本人の安全保障観念というのは非常に言ってみれば抽象的な脅威観念であったわけですね。これがやはり当時のイスラエルの人たちの持っているスレッドパーセプションというものを要するにその当時の日本人がどこまで理解し得たかっていうのは甚だ心もとなかったというふうに思います。それから40年50年経ってですね、今私が思うのは要するに双方の側がですねこういうその脅威概念というかスレッドパーセプションというのを軸にして割合に感覚が似てきてるんじゃないかというふうに思うんですね。当時と違って日本の今の脅威観念っていうのはやはりかなり具体的なものになってきてます。DPRK の問題とか中国の教育とか、要するに皆が割合に肌身感覚で感じるような脅威の概念、これも日本とイスラエルとで割合に同じような感覚を持ちつつあるのかなという気が一方にしますし、その先ほどのアブラハム合意のようにですね、イスラエルという国家がアラブ世界で、広く受容されつつあるように、思われるわけですね。もちろんイランのような実存的脅威というものも他方に大きくなっているのは事実なんですけれども、しかし40年50年前の周り中全部敵だらけというですねそういう状況とはかなり違ってきていて、平和ボケとは言わないまでも要するに平和とか安全保障とかいうものについてのですね感覚が双方で共有できるものが結構広がってきているのではないかと。これが一つ今私の感じていることですね。それからもう一つは今度はですね日本の側の魚の話でありますが、これはもちろんフィッシュなんだけどこれ言ってみれば理念的なですね例えばクライメートって言われる問題ですよね。これは例えば今バイデン政権が直面しているアメリカが直面している3つの C っていうのがありますね。一つはCOVID-19 で要するに新型コロナへの対策であるし、他方においては要するに中国の台頭にどう対応するかという問題でもありますし、それから3つ目にクライメートクライシスですね。いわゆる気候変動の問題と、これ地球環境の問題の一つの象徴なんでしょうが、これはそのバイデン政権ならずともこれだけグローバル化した世界において皆が共有しなければならない問題意識のはずですよね。でこういう問題のほかに例えばイスラエルはイランのような個別の脅威があるし、 日本の場合には DPRK なんかの、個別の問題をそれぞれ抱えているということなんですが、しかし共有するようなさまざまな課題というのがですね、どんどん広がってきていて、その分だけ私は日本とイスラエルとの間の肌身感覚での距離っていうのはこの4、50年前と比べると極めて近くなってきているのではないか、共有できるものがたくさんある、そういう状況に向いてきているように思います。それだけにお互いにですね、連携あるいは提携、協力、相互補完、こういうものを強めていける余地が非常に広がってきていると。我々両国の関係をですね、より強め高めていくというそういう意義は非常に大きくなってきているというふうに思います。ちょっと個人的な感想でありますが、一応これでコメントということにさせてください。
Thank you very much, Professor Ikeda. It's really important. It really matters for all of us because your reflections on the past decade, 4 decades of your own research, you are really pioneering scholar on international security surrounding Israel in Japan, and it corresponds to the growing relationship between Japan and Israel itself. So your comment is very grave for us. And Professor Otmazgin, how about your response to Professor Ikeda's comment?
Thank you so much for this wonderful comments. Sakaneni kakomareteru. I like this one very much. And of course, I was a student of Professor Ehud Harari, Professor Melo Menzini, and Professor Benami Shiloni. And I speak with them almost every week. And I'm proud to be the students, and you identified it correctly, how everything is connected. And I'm happy to continue some of the work. I think let me just briefly address also the question that Ikeusi sensei also mentioned about the political aspect and about relations. I can tell you that Japan has, in my view, it has gradually, since the Oslo Accord of 2002, gradually increased in its involvement in the Middle East as part of its, I would say, opening for world politics. We see more activism of Japan in international institutions, for example, the sending of the PKOs, a bit more involvement than it used to be. In the Middle East, and specifically in Israel, starting from 2002, as I mentioned, I can see a big change of the relationship and bigger involvement. And as an Israeli and as a scholar of Japan, I'm very happy about this, actually. I think that Japan should continue and have a bigger role in Middle East, especially with the Abraham Accord, with the Israeli relations with its neighbors. I think that this involvement appeared, Japan was one of the sponsors of the Oslo Peace Accord, and it had a constructive role in trying to mediate between Palestinians and Israelis. PKO soldiers were sent to the Golan Heights, just on the borders between Israel and Japan. And many Israelis, they appreciate it very much. We need those UN forces there on the borders to maintain stability and peace. My only hope is that Japan will continue with this. Now with the corona, following the corona, we see that in many aspects, Japan is shutting its borders, appears at least it is less interested in world affairs. And I hope that this will continue. I think that Japan has an important role in consolidating and supporting dialogue between Israel and its neighbors. I know that Japan is doing great to support Palestinian local empowerment. I met the president of JICA just before the outbreak of Corona here, and they're running a few projects. And helping the Palestinian economy, maintaining a good economy, is an Israeli interest. So my only hope is that Japan following the corona will not go back to more seclusion, but actually continue to be more and more proactive in its Middle East politics. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you for your response and comment to both of us. And may I follow up, further on this topic of political diplomatic relationship, particularly after the Abraham Accord 2020. You have mentioned, after the Oslo Accord in 1993, Japanese involvement in Israel and Japanese involvement in Israeli-Palestinian issue has been, growing and continuous. But my question is, but what about after the Abraham Accord? Is there any, satisfiable, how can I say, appropriate change on the Japanese side? Do you notice, in your presentation, economic and investment level and cultural exchanges, they are, really growing, and they are changing generationally. So, but how do you assess, Japanese? We are non-governmental, platform. So we have a freedom of speech. So how do you assess Japanese, government diplomatic policy? How do they respond to the new situation created after the Abraham Accord? Of course, Ambassador Cohen pointed out, we do not need, always government to be present in people-to-people relationships is more important, and without governmental help, we can go further away. But this issue, Abraham Accord, and after the Abraham Accord, I expected more, strategic, opportunity for Japan, particularly on Japanese side. But there are growing expectations on the side of Israel. But in my view, Japanese response on the political diplomatic level, it's not so responsive enough. But how about your opinion?
Thank you so much. Indeed, in the past few years, we see that the economic consolidation of relations is increasing. You see businesses, you see investments, and I think the reason for this is there are two main reasons. The first one is, there is a policy support. The visits of Prime Minister Abe in 1915 and 1918 again. It shows the private sector that diplomatic relations are firm. It's a sign for the private sector to go in and make the business. But this is not the only reason. Another reason is actually because Chinese and Korean companies have been investing more actively than Japanese companies before that. So there is always this flying geese competition that maybe there is some markets to think about here. So I think those are the two driving engines which actually give a good signals for the private sector to collaborate more. About the UAE-Israel and the Abraham Accord relations, I think strategically, it is much more easier for Japan to have better relations or to consolidate relations with Israel if Israel has better relationships with its neighbors. Because Japan, it has an interest, it has regional and international interest. It has to consider, if too strong support for Israel might mean, might influence its relations with the wider Arab world. And this is something that Japan was very careful in doing. And as I mentioned, the oil shock was a breaking point. But once Israel is consolidating its relations with the wider Arab world, having a peace process or having peace relations and having a very friendly relations, I think it signals for the Japanese that it is safer to go ahead and consolidate the relations with Israel. And perhaps Japan can actually have some kind of role. One thing that I know that in the Gulf state, in the UAE, they are very much interested these days in security issue, and especially maritime security issues going from East Asia to the Gulf. And I think in this sense, Japan, the involvement of Japan and China and the United States is something to take into consideration. Actually, next month I was invited to Abu Dhabi for a conference on Asian maritime security. So this is something that the Abu Dhabi people are very much interested in. So I think we have to look at it in a wider strategic consideration. And no doubt, the interest of Japan and of Israel is actually to consolidate better relations between Israel and its Arab neighbors.
Thank you very much. Japan and Israel have very different kind of decision-making process, and you know better than me about Japanese way, and that's why you are patient about it, and we are steadily, stepping forward. And as Professor Otmazgin mentioned, Japanese policy toward Israel is little by little overcoming or overstepping from the very traditional bilateral relations to trilateral relations involving other countries such as United Arab Emirates. And I think this kind of trilateral relationship is the future for the more upgraded relationship with Israel. And we both countries can play a role in both regions and cooperate together, bridging the vast sea of the Indian Ocean. So I think our relationships future is bright. Thank you very much.
I think just one word. I think that in Israel and in the Arab world, Japan is considered as a honest broker. Unlike, let's say, European countries or China or the United States, Japan has the image of a honest broker. And I think this is something that Japan should cash on and be more proactive, hopefully.
Thank you very much. You reminded me or you reminded us of our asset, which has been built for generation of Japanese diplomats and policymakers. Thank you very much for that. And Ikeda Sensei, how about your comment? Any comments about the relationship between Japan and Israel, and any comment to us?
あれですね。一つ今、オネストブローカーとしての、日本の評価っていうのは、その通りだと思いますが、もう一つ、やはり日本が、中東なり、イスラエルも含めてですが、そこで評価されているのはですね、プリッジしたものはディスバースするっていうですね、要するに、口先だけではなくて、よく言われるのはディシジョンメイキングが遅いけれども、一旦決めたものはちゃんと律儀にコミットしていくんだと。この立場っていうのはやっぱり日本は崩すべきではないだろうというふうに思います。からもう一つこれは要するにイスラエルが今日本に与えているイメージっていうのはいわゆるスタートアップネーションですね。スタートアップネーションでしかも非常に、国を挙げてイノベーションになんちゅうんですかね、要するに投資をしていて、これがもう世界中に広がっていって、日本もできたらそういうところとベンチャーをやりたいというこれが高まってきてるわけですね。だけども同時にですねこれやっぱり裏表あるわけですよね。例えば今いろんなところで問題になっているペガサスの問題とかですねいったようなことまでやると要するにこういう問題でどこまで透明性とかですね説明責任とかというのを 開示できるかというのは、やっぱり日本も含めてちょっと検討していかなければならないその課題なのかなと思うわけですね。先ほどちょっと触れられたような、その民主主義のランキングでどのぐらいにいるかという、そういう問題ともこれ絡んでくると思うんですね。で日本っていうのは割合にイスラエルとそのランキングでも近いわけですし、持っている問題の関心というのをすり合わせていくというのがかなり重要なのではないかというふうに思いますですね。
Thank you very much for your very kind admonition or advice. And so how about,
Yeah, I should, I think this is very important, Ikeda Sensei, the issue of democracy. And actually, I mentioned Professor Ehud Harari, and he wrote a book in Hebrew about Japanese politics. And the title of the book is Maturing Democracy, as he called it. And maturing democracy is a democracy such as Israel or Japan that acknowledges its strengths and weaknesses and attempts to improve. And I think this is very important. You mentioned the Pegasus scandal that we're hearing these days in Japan. And this is something that it is very important to continue. And this is something which is very important to emphasize in both Israel and Japan. We're talking about democratic principles. We are very close, as you mentioned, in the ranks. We rank Japan is, well, it is in a better ranking than Israel. It's 17th in the World Democracy Index of last year, and Israel's is 23. But yeah, Chikai, they are very close to each other. So this is something that is very important and that connects between us. Another thing that we should remember, we are also important allies of the United States, each in its own region. Japan in East Asia and Israel in the Middle East, with very strong connections with the United States. And this is something, of course, which provides an excellent framework for more collaboration.
Thank you very much. We have already covered many of the important issues between us, and we are coming to the end of today's seminar, but in the coming week, next week, we will one by one touch upon these issues recommended by Professor Ikeda and, of course, Professor Otmazgin. So I would like to thank all the speakers and participants, and thank you very much for participating in this webinar today. As for our event, I have already mentioned Israel Month. The next week, we have 3 more webinars. One is on green tech, and another is blockchain technology. And the third one is, of course, diplomatic policy just around the Abraham Accord, and what's the impact on the region, in the Middle East region, by this historic accord. So for further information, please visit our website, Roads U Tokyo Israel Month. So thank you again for the participants and all of our participants, and particularly speakers, commentators. Thank you, Professor Otmazgin and Professor Ikeda. Thank you very much.
ありがとうございました。
ありがとうございました。Thank you very much.